For much of the last 200 years, China wasn't expected to rise. It was expected to collapse. By the early 1900s, China had lost wars, lost territory, and lost control over its own future. And yet, collapse didn't come once, it came again and again. Rebellion, invasion, civil war, famine. By every historical measure, China should not exist as a unified power today. So how did a civilization that spent centuries on the brink of failure become the second largest power of the 21st century? The answer isn't destiny. It's a series of hard choices, brutal lessons, and one fundamental shift that changed everything. In this video, we'll trace China's path from imperial collapse through revolution and reinvention to the moment the world finally realized China had survived and was no longer waiting.
This is the world we inherited.
When people think about China's collapse, they usually imagine one moment: the fall of the Qing dynasty, the end of the emperors, the birth of modern China. But that's not what actually happened. China didn't collapse once, it collapsed repeatedly. In the 19th century, the Qing dynasty was already hollow. Corruption weakened the state, the economy stagnated, local officials ruled more than the central government. Then came the rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion alone killed tens of millions, one of the deadliest civil wars in human history. As China struggled internally, foreign powers moved in. The Opium Wars forced China open. Unequal treaties stripped away sovereignty. Foreign nations carved out spheres of influence, not by colonizing China outright, but by controlling it from the inside. By the early 1900s, China had lost control of its trade, its borders, and even its laws in parts of its own cities. When the Qing dynasty finally fell in 1911, it didn't bring stability. It opened the door to warlords, fragmentation, and endless civil war. This is the part that often gets missed. Most nations don't survive one collapse. China survived several without breaking apart permanently. And that raises a much bigger question. Why didn't China disappear the way so many others did? After decades of collapse, war, and invasion, China didn't need reform. It needed reconstruction. By 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party took power, the country they inherited was shattered. Infrastructure was ruined. The countryside was poor. The population was exhausted by warlords, civil war, and foreign occupation. The common explanation is that communism saved China. But that's too simple and mostly wrong. What mattered wasn't the ideology, it was control. For the first time in generations, China had a central authority strong enough to eliminate warlords, enforce borders, and impose order across the entire country. Land reform broke the old rural power structures and tied millions of peasants directly to the state. The government reached villages the empire never truly controlled. This wasn't about equality, it was about survival. The Communist Party didn't just rule China, it rebuilt China's ability to function as a single system. National identity replaced imperial loyalty. Unity replaced fragmentation. And for the first time in over a century, China stopped bleeding territory and authority. The cost was enormous: political repression, violence, famine. But something fundamental had changed. China was no longer falling apart. It was being held together, tightly. Stability alone doesn't create power. And in the decades after 1949, China learned that lesson the hard way. Central control brought unity, but it also brought disaster. Policies like the Great Leap Forward pushed ideology ahead of reality. The result was famine on a massive scale. Then came the Cultural Revolution. Institutions collapsed, education stopped, expertise was punished. Once again, China came dangerously close to destroying itself from within. Many countries would have broken at this point. China didn't. Instead, something rare happened. Failure was acknowledged, quietly, internally, and without surrendering control. After Mao's death, China pivoted, not toward democracy, but toward pragmatism. Under Deng Xiaoping, ideology took a back seat to results. Markets were tested, regions experimented, mistakes were tolerated as long as they produced growth. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, Deng famously said, as long as it catches mice. This was the real shift. China kept its political system, but changed how it used it. Adaptation replaced dogma, performance replaced purity. And for the first time, China wasn't just surviving, it was improving. As China began to change, the world kept watching the wrong signals. Western powers had seen China as weak for over a century, backward, imitative, permanently catching up. Even as reforms accelerated, many believed China would eventually liberalize or collapse. Instead, China focused on something far less visible: capacity. Factories before flags, infrastructure before influence. When China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, it wasn't a breakthrough, it was a confirmation. Decades of planning were finally being integrated into the global system. Manufacturing scaled at a speed the world had never seen. Supply chains shifted, cities expanded. Ports, roads, and railways connected the country internally before projecting power outward. To the outside world, China still looked like a low-cost producer. Inside China, the foundations of long-term power were already in place. By the time global attention caught up, the gap was no longer closing, it was widening. China didn't survive because it was destined to. It survived because it remembered. For centuries, Chinese leaders studied collapse, not as tragedy, but as instruction. Dynasties fell when the center weakened, when authority fragmented, when short-term comfort replaced long-term stability. Modern China absorbed those lessons deeply. Control came before freedom, stability came before growth, and growth came before global influence. This wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate rejection of chaos. While other nations chased quick wins, China planned decades ahead. While others reacted, China prepared. The goal was never popularity, the goal was survival, and then power. That is what changed. Not ideology, not destiny, but a system built to endure pressure, absorb failure, and think in generations. China was never supposed to survive, and that is precisely why it did. China's rise wasn't sudden. It was slow, painful, and often invisible. A nation that survived collapse after collapse learned to value control over chaos, patience over impulse, and endurance over comfort. From imperial decay to revolution, from disaster to adaptation, China didn't rise by avoiding failure, it rose by absorbing it. And that history still shapes how China moves, plans, and responds today. If you want to understand the modern world, you can't just watch China's power. You have to understand how it survived long enough to build it. What do you think the world still misunderstands about China today? If you enjoyed the video, do not forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share so others can understand how China, a nation heading towards failure, changed its own destiny.